It's spring 2019 and I am walking along Vauxhall Bridge from the south of London, headed toward the Tate Britain. I briefly studied at Art College next door, so this is a familiar journey, one I've made lots of times. But this time I've come looking for something in particular. I've come with a question. The answer to my question is a painting by the Guyanese artist Frank Bowling from the 1980s called Spread Out Ronchitai. Bowling's an abstract expressionist painter who was born in the former British colony, who's practiced in London and in the US. Bowling is the subject of his first major retrospective at the Tate, marking his many decades of making work. His paintings often push the materials of visual expression to the limit. They test what colour can do, they test out different kinds of influences and make different kinds of references. They make untenable false divisions between the weight of tradition and the pleasures of exile. Anyway, back to this particular painting, hung in a big white room in the Tate. I've seen it on the internet and in books, but never in real life, and the effect is disorientating. For the first time, I see the half-obscured outline of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man and the thick, spatula smears of acrylic gel. I spot the plastic children's toys stuck to the canvas and in time. So here's the thing. In 1987, the year that I was born, this painting was the Tate's first purchase of a painting by an artist of African Caribbean descent. It's one of just 3 works by Bowling, a relatively prolific painter, owned by National Collections in the UK prior to the renewed interest in his work around the millennium. And it was an acquisition made through the publicly funded Arts Council of Great Britain, a body that exemplifies light touch state patronage, funding with no strings attached. This painting archives a key moment in the career of a painter often made marginal in standard histories of British art. Bowling was a self-described modernist, trained at the Royal College of Art in London with other members of the London School in the 50s, like David Hockney and R.B. Kitaj, who the painting is titled after. But Bowling found his career stymied in Britain, chiefly because England, as one commentator put it in the 60s, was not yet ready for a gifted artist of colour, especially an abstractionist. So Bowling switched London for New York for long periods of his career. But such denials of Bowling's status as both black and British were not borne out. For one thing, the influence of Turner and Constable and the Thames itself on Bowling's depiction of aerial and alluvial light set him increasingly apart from his American contemporaries in the Black Arts movement. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, on the one hand, Bowling's purchase is a vivid example of official interest in black aesthetic production, as the Tate's first purchase of a painting by an African Caribbean artist, Spread Out Ronchitai registers a major moment in the cultural history of Britain, a moment when the British state imagined that art and literature could create a culture fit for a multicultural democracy. But paradoxically, on the other hand, the painting is a vivid counter-example of any such remedial narrative of state support. 1987, by all accounts, is pretty late for this purchase to happen. And it would be foolish to pretend that the state's mechanisms of privilege did not perpetuate the kind of social inequalities that affect careers in the long term. And an uneven artistic field poses major problems to the equity of public culture. So what does this all have to do with Britain's state-sponsored literature? By way of an example from the visual arts, it registers some of the claims that I make in my research about who the state imagined and provided for in its funding. The question of who pays the piper, or rather the writer, not only bothered artists and writers, but also governments after the Second World War, when the British government made historic strides to support literature and other kinds of art financially, rather than simply play Big Brother. You might say that what happened was something relatively unthinkable in today's terms: state investment in writing with apparently few strings attached. But we're still largely in the dark about what this meant in practice, who it included or excluded, for what reasons, and what those strings turned out to be. This talk today is based on my research, which is captured in a book called State-Sponsored Literature, Britain and Cultural Diversity After 1945, and it discusses state funding of the literary world. One of the things I argue is that the modern state became a major material condition of literature, its production, its publication, its circulation after World War II. We often think of the state in its guise as Big Brother, but it had other roles as well, using public funding to head off some of the more obviously commercial threats to literary writing. Timothy Garton Ash and Corey Bretschneider call this kind of phenomena the state's expressive acts. In other words, the state was acting as an educator, a spender, or a subsidizer by putting up monuments, commissioning or buying art, funding museums, opening libraries, hosting events like the Olympic Games opening ceremony, instituting professional codes, enforcing copyright, subsidising literary and cultural works, giving out grants, awarding prizes, offering tax relief, or threatening to withdraw these kinds of protections. These expressive acts say something, and what they say, one way or another, is that creative acts of writing matter. My research makes the modern state, so often characterised as unknowable, knowable, by taking a closer look at the role of government-related organisations and the role they've played in shaping literary writing. So organisations like the Arts Council, set up by the economist John Maynard Keynes after the war, have played a really important role in this history of the democratic state's efforts to offer economic protection to writers and to makers of art. We also have the British Council, examination boards that supply schools with materials for the national curriculum, and even international cultural policy bodies like UNESCO. So take George Orwell, for example. Though often used as a poster boy against the oppressive functions of the state, the kinds of things he imagined in 1984, Orwell himself saw authoritarian governments as not the biggest problem for writers. The public could also fail to buy books and buy cigarettes instead, and this could also be detrimental to the production of literature. The realm of economic competition, Orwell remarked, was a worse tyranny than the state, because it was more irresponsible. The trouble with competitions, he pointed out, was that someone always won them. With this in mind, my research looks again at the writers and the works that benefited from state grants and protection, from T.S. Eliot to Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. Because although valuable in ideas and in creativity, it risked its own status by being commercially unviable. It required protection from the state. To this, we can also add the role of writers like Cecil Day-Lewis or Margaret Drabble, who became literary experts to advise governments on what counted as worth protecting, what counted as good art or good writing, and to advocate for change in protecting some kinds of literature over others. So what does this look like in practice, this idea that literature is supported by the state? Let's take the British Council, for example. So the British Council was set up in 1984 to, and I'm quoting from its kind of original mantra, if you like, to promote abroad a wider knowledge of the English language and literature as part of our national life. That was what it existed to do. The British Council's Books and Periodicals Committee believed that the calibre of a nation could be judged according to how it treated books. So figures like the publishing magnate Stanley Unwin believed that books possessed a role that was much higher than their commercial status. And he worked hard to use the apparatus of the state to ensure that the kinds of obstacles that meant the books couldn't freely flow across borders were done away with. He brokered export deals and other kinds of schemes to ensure that a high quality literature, so in other words a better kind of book, could reach a modern public of book readers and not just bestsellers. Literature, in other words, belonged to a special category of printed text. So bodies like the British Council played a major role in establishing the conditions in which readers could read, writers could write, and publishers could make things public. But if we look a bit closer, we can see that the state's efforts to do this were often partial, relative, and liable to disruption. Historically important efforts, like the British Council's, to ensure that literature had a right to survive and could exist on its own terms other than a commodity, were often fraught with their own tensions, difficulties, and limitations. So let's go back to the British Council and its commitment to, quote, promote abroad a wider knowledge of the English language and English literature. So one of the ways it did this was by founding libraries overseas. And yet they soon realised that if spreading the gospel of English culture and national identity was their goal, then actually lots of so-called English writers drew on the world beyond to talk about their own Englishness. So what then? In reality, the British Council was rapidly trying to transform itself to a changing world. In reality, it was less motivated by marketing a pre-identified canon of great works in English than in trying to compete with its rivals in Europe, particularly France and Germany, in this new world of what we call cultural diplomacy or literary diplomacy or soft power. Excising foreign elements from its book lists might appear to guarantee a clearly bounded English identity that could be marketed and consumed abroad, but as a literary policy it risked looking a bit too nationalistic. It risked looking a bit too much like France, which was motivated by an idea of linguistic exceptionalism, and it also risked looking a bit too much like Germany, which, as we know, had a kind of dubious relationship to ethnic exclusivity in the 1930s. Positioned in a no-man's land between its European rivals, the British Council was bound to a kind of equivocal position, and the question of the cultural identity of its book lists fell right in the middle of this quandary. None of these acts of sponsorship or protection happened in a historical vacuum, and in particular, the unrivaled large-scale migration of people from former British colonies played a particularly significant role when it came to testing out the state's official commitments to literary publics, its official commitments to the people it imagined were reading and writing literature, and it imagined it needed to provide for in its funding. Publics are imagined, but they're also situated, and the historical context of Commonwealth migration and British multiculturalism is central to this history of Britain's state-sponsored literature. The changing ethnic, racial, and cultural structure of society impacted the state's policies, its practices, and its procedures, partly in the shape of the literary experts who advised the government on how it should be spending its money, and who often contested, queried, and sharpened its thinking, sharpened its assumptions. In the Arts Council of the 1980s, for instance, the poets David Daberdeen and James Berry and the publisher Margaret Busby advised the Arts Council on the specific difficulties writers of colour, black writers especially, faced in accessing the relatively closed world of literary publishing. James Berry, for instance, gave compelling testimony to the courts about the need for targeted literary funding to level the playing field for black writers who might otherwise be forever consigned to the status of literary amateur. He shared his own experiences of accessing the relatively closed old-school tie network that dictated who was published. And his words from the 1980s really echo more recent reports from the 21st century about the white-dominated, middle-class UK publishing industry. Berry's words had authority. Having arrived from Jamaica in 1948, Berry had worked for 26 years in the post office before belatedly achieving literary recognition in 1981. David Daberdeen, another writer, another poet, worked within the Arts Council and combined his commitment to strengthen the black cultural field with a principled concern that the state's role was only to uphold the very best art. So he lobbied hard for greater infrastructural support for small independent black and Asian presses. The subsidising of editorial wages, that was one of his ideas, as was encouraging big trade presses to adopt fledgling counterpart presses. Margaret Busby drew on her unique experience as one of the few senior black women in British publishing and a co-founder of the organisation Greater Access to Publishing to explain how the existing systems of patronage were designed for a white, middle-class, professional idea of the writer. Targeted opportunities for neglected writers would be valuable in a material sense in terms of cash, but they were also symbolic in countering prevailing preconceptions about the kinds of aesthetic work that black writers might actually produce if they were properly supported. In a 1945 broadcast for the BBC, John Maynard Keynes, the founder of the Arts Council of Great Britain, imagined state patronage as a great ship. No one could predict where the tides of the times would carry this ship of sponsorship with no strings attached. As the century proceeded, the metaphor would be taken up again. And the metaphor is actually from Plato's Republic, this idea of the great ship of state and this idea of culture at the heart of the state. Anyway, it would be taken up again in the 1980s by those who were trying to transform the British cultural field. By the late 1980s, Govan Youngies, the South African visual artist tasked with reforming the Arts Council to make it more culturally diverse, took up the metaphor of the great ship of state once again. But he was less idealistic about it. This publicly funded field was no longer the domain of Bloomsbury. Reforming Britain's major cultural institutions was like turning a sailing ocean liner 180 degrees in bad weather before it leaves the harbour. Mapping the coordinates of institutional change meant nothing if the passengers were to mutiny or to jump off board. If the coming together of state investment in the cultural field after World War II and our national story of multi-ethnicity has been crucial to post-war writing, which I argue that it has, it's also true that literature's fate as something else, something other than a commodity, a special kind of writing, can't be easily divorced from the kinds of transformations that are happening at the end of empire, socially, politically and artistically. Instead, it's intricately woven into them. As I speak today, there are once again fresh debates about structured support for the arts and humanities, for writing and for the study of literature, as well as the making of literature. A historical perspective on state literary support strengthens the case to bring the state back in, when evidence continues to suggest that a more commercialised literary culture only replicates structural inequalities. Knowing all this stuff about the conditions in which writers write and in which readers access writing changes how we think about literature in recent history, and it changes how we read it as well. It also changes how we think about the state itself as having a long and enduring relationship to the arts at a time when this is once again being contested. The record of the state's involvement in the literary world for the sake of its own existence ought not to be lost to history. Instead, we need to understand the reasons why governments sanction particular kinds of creativity at particular times for particular reasons, and the implications for writers, for readers, and for us.